On most weekends, I would go on road trips to visit my friends, considering their campuses were a lot bigger and more fun than my small town college. During this particular weekend in question, I was getting ready to make about a 2-hour trip to see my friend Kyle. I had made the same trip about 30 times before, so I knew the route pretty well at this point and didn't even have to use GPS to get there. I left on Friday afternoon, once I was done with classes for the day, and I was set to arrive at Kyle's dorm at about 8 o'clock p.m., right on time to go out for a night of binge drinking and eating garbage food. I set off at about 5:50 and was roughly 15 minutes into my trip when my girlfriend called me. This was pretty unusual considering I'd already told her I was driving to Kyle's. So I answered quickly, thinking something must have been wrong. She was working that night, and her car had broken down in her dorm room parking lot when she was leaving to go work her shift. She figured I wasn't too far into my trip and wanted to know if I could give her a quick ride to work before I go far away. Me, being the dutiful boyfriend I was, agreed to come get her since I was only about 20 minutes away from her location. I was already pretty far off campus, so I pulled over my car on the highway and used GPS to see if there is a faster route to her from where I was. The map on my phone revealed that there was an exit coming up that would take me to a side street that I could use to get to her fairly quickly. So I texted her that I was on my way and set off towards my new destination. I had seen the exit in question plenty of times, but I never had any reason to get off on it. So once I exited the highway, my surroundings were completely unfamiliar to me. The exit took me off onto a road that had dense woods on the right side and the highway on the left side. My phone informed me that my next turn wasn't for about 5 miles, so I had a ways to go until I had to do any navigating. About a half a mile later, the road had turned and there were now trees on either side of me, and to be honest, it was a really beautiful sight. It was October, so the surrounding woods were a mixture of various warm colors, and I was actually really enjoying my little detour. The entire area was wooded on either side with only the occasional break in tree line for a driveway and a mailbox to poke out. The houses were pretty hard to see through the trees, but from the few glimpses I did manage to get, the houses were actually pretty nice. It was getting a little dark, and I had about a mile to go before I had to turn, when I noticed a Toyota with the hood popped open further down the road. As I approached, I noticed a man in a shirt and tie with his head under the hood, seemingly with a broke down car. There was no traffic to be seen behind me, so I stopped for a moment to ask him if everything was okay, and if he needed to borrow my phone or anything. He didn't seem to hear me at first, so a little louder this time I said, "Everything okay?" This time he seemed to have heard me, and he lifted his head up away from the engine and looked up at me. He seemed like a completely normal guy, and he had a normal face to match. The best way I could describe him is just pedestrian looking. He had short brown hair, brown eyes, and a 5 o'clock shadow. He smiled at me, and he said he was on his way home from work, and that something had gone wrong with his engine. I offered him my phone, in case he wanted to call anyone to get picked up or get the car towed. He replied, "Oh, no, that's okay. I have a car service that will come and get me a car for me. They're closed until tomorrow morning though, so I hate to ask, but could you possibly give me a ride to my brother's house? He's living only like 4 minutes away from here." This absolutely should have been a red flag for me. I think I was a little stunned by how normal this guy seemed considering most hitchhikers on TV are crazy or are ex-murderers. Why couldn't he have used my phone to call his brother? I guess I wasn't thinking clearly at the time, but hindsight is 20/20, and I'm well aware I made a bad decision that night. I was physically much bigger than him, and he was driving a nice car, so I figured he wasn't a weirdo or local crazy person, and I could overpower him if need be. So I agreed to give him a quick ride to his brother's house, since he was on the way to my girlfriend's. I unlocked the door for him to get in, and he pointed me in the direction of his brother's house, and we set off on our way. Things were pretty normal for a few minutes, and I was starting to feel like maybe I did the right thing. Then, things started to get weirder. The first thing that made me uncomfortable was the way he acted every time there was a swear word in the music I was listening to. He was almost flinching every time 50 Cent said F or B. And I picked it up on pretty quickly, so I changed the song thinking he was just really against swearing or something. About a minute after I changed the song, there was no swearing in this one. He reached up and slammed his hand on the radio's power button and turned it off. It wasn't crazy hard or anything, but it was definitely enough to get me to notice. I tried to make light of the situation and said, "Not your style?" This question was met with complete silence. At this point, I was ready for this guy to get out of my car, so I asked, "How much further do we have to go? I have to be somewhere soon and I can't be late." He said we had about 4 minutes to go, which immediately sent up warning signals in my head, considering he had told me the same thing about 8 minutes ago. I decided that was enough. I didn't think he was dangerous or anything, but I figured our destination was further than he was letting on, and he was lying so that I would take him despite the distance. It was getting late, and I wasn't trying to face my girlfriend's wrath, so I told him this was as far as I could go and he'd have to walk the rest of the way. His mood changed immediately, but instead of getting angry, which I was completely expecting, he became panicky and was practically begging me to take him all the way. His overreaction set off pretty much every alarm I had in my head, so I told him to remove himself from my car before I had to remove him myself. It was then he pulled out his rather oversized wallet and offered to pay me to take him all the way. He tried to pull out a stack of $20 bills, but as he removed them from his wallet, something else fell out of his wallet onto the seat next to him. It was only a split second before he grabbed it and shoved it back into his pocket, but I got a good enough look at it to haunt me for the rest of the day. Along with his money, a small Ziploc bag full of what I'm very confident were adult teeth fell out of his wallet. Front teeth, molars, you name it. Everyone I've told this story to has been skeptical of this part, but I'm confident that was what I saw. I freaked out, worse than I ever have, and screamed at him to get out of my car, and he got out immediately and was looking at me with surprised eyes on the side of the road. I took off and called the police, who simply told me not to pick up hitchhikers ever again, and that they couldn't do anything since the man didn't commit any crimes. I don't know where he was going or what he was doing, and I'm pretty sure I don't want to know. I do know, however, that he seemed to have all of his teeth still in his mouth, and to this day, I still don't know whose teeth those were or why he had them with him. This story took place 2 years ago. I was on my second week backpacking through Austria, and I reached a point where I was too exhausted to walk any longer. It was an unusual hot day. I had blisters all over my feet, and I was ready to call it quits. I was in the middle of nowhere and decided to thumb a lift to the nearest train station. But I was out of luck. I stood there for what felt like hours, and no car would pick me up. I don't blame them. I spent 2 weeks sleeping in the woods, my clothes were dirty, and I probably looked like a maniac. When finally a truck pulled up, I didn't hesitate to hop inside because I was so thankful to be able to sit down and rest my feet for a while. I asked the driver if he could drop me at the nearest train station so I could catch a train to Vienna, but he told me that he was heading back there anyway, and that he could take me there as long as I didn't mind him making a stopover to load the truck. I didn't, and so we drove along. We made some small talk and he seemed to be very polite. It was a pretty enjoyable ride until we reached the first stop. He loaded his truck while I walked around a bit and bought some water at the gas station nearby. He had offered me drinks a few times along the ride, but I always declined because I don't feel comfortable with that. I got back into the truck and we continued to drive to Vienna. Almost immediately after we took off again, he told me that it wouldn't be a problem for him if I wanted to take some clothes off, since it was a very hot day. I told him that I was fine, but he brought it up a couple more times. He also asked me if I wanted to take a nap in the back, and that he had several hitchhikers sleeping there in the past. I declined again, and started to feel a little uneasy around him, and planned to leave the truck at the next gas stop. All of a sudden, he nearly yelled at me to put my head down and hide, because he was driving past his stepfather's car, and he didn't want him to see him with me in the truck. That struck me as odd, but I did it anyway because his yelling took me by surprise. That confirmed my resolution to get out of there as soon as possible, and I asked him to drop me off at the next stop. I made up an excuse that it was my goal to enter Vienna by feet, and that I was well rested enough to make it, thanks to his lift. He agreed, and I got my stuff ready. He suddenly turned to me and said that I looked familiar, and that he was sure he saw me somewhere before. I shrugged it off, but he insisted he remembered my face. He asked me if I ever went to a swinger club, because he was sure he saw me there sometime. That caught me completely off guard, and I told him that it was impossible because I'd never been to one. With his face still pointing at me, he asked, "Well, do you want to? I'm going to one in Vienna. Let's go there together. I'm sure you'll like it." At this point, I really wanted to get out of the truck as soon as possible, and told him that I had no intention to come with him, and asked him to drop me off right now. He didn't answer, but reached into his pants and started masturbating while he drove along. I froze up, clutching my backpack on my lap, and didn't know what to do. I kept thinking that I'd jump off as soon as he stopped somewhere, and tried to ignore what he was doing there since he didn't respond to my plea to let me out. A gas station was coming up, and he stopped what he was doing and asked if we should take a shower together. I figured that there'd be some people around, and that it would make it easier to get rid of him. So I told him sure, why not? He pulled over, and as soon as he stopped, I yanked open the door and ran across the parking area of the gas station, hoping that he wouldn't come after me. He didn't, so I just kept running until the station was out of sight, and I reached a busy street. Only after my heart stopped racing and I catch my breath, I realized I left my shoes at the truck. I walked the last few kilometers bare feet, and kept a lookout for the truck until I reached Vienna. I was pretty brave when I was younger. Or maybe I had that sense of invincibility that comes with youth. I had survived some things. A stalker who pursued my sister and I for over a year and a half, being assaulted, 2 house fires, and growing up in a house that I swear to you was haunted. Not in that Disney way either. I'm talking torture chambers in the basement and strange things going on. Anyway, I suppose looking back, that having been through all of that made me feel a little like either I was some sort of invincible, or maybe I just assumed that I'd gotten all of the bad stuff out of the way, and nothing else would happen. Whatever it was, I learned to know better. When I was 17, I didn't have a driver's license. I walked most places, occasionally catching rides with friends, and less occasionally, hitchhiking. The night in question was one of those rare seen occasions when I decided to hitchhike, having worked late and being too exhausted to walk. Now, most of the time when I'd hitch a ride, I wouldn't get in the car with a lone man. Only women, or rarely men, with a wife or a girlfriend or kids in the car. This night though, cars were few and far between, and it was cold, and really, if I'm being perfectly frank, when he pulled over, I took a good look and figured I could take him if he tried something. He was on the slender side, and had a strange frailness about him, even though he looked healthy enough. I got into the car after we agreed on the destination. We exchanged names, and I warmed my fingers in front of the heating vent. He spoke quietly, asking a few questions along the lines of, was I a local, and how did I like living there? He said he'd only been there a couple of months, but found it beautiful and hoped he could find happiness there. That comment struck me as a little odd, but I brushed it off. It began to snow, and the road quickly got slippery, so he slowed down and kept his eyes straight at the windshield, driving silently. I was okay with that, as small talk was never my forte. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a car near the intersection we were approaching seemed to be sliding, so I said, "Watch out!" He immediately hit the gas, shooting through the intersection, and burst out with, "Don't ever scream at me again." Needless to say, I was taken aback. I said, "Look, this is close enough, just pull over here and I can get there." He didn't seem to hear me, so I asked him again, "Can you pull over and let me out?" No response. He just stared straight ahead, driving faster now than he had been since it began to snow. To say I was scared doesn't seem to cover the depth of fear that began to rise in me. I didn't know if I should stay quiet or speak, but I was damn sure not going to yell after that outburst. After about a mile, he began to mumble under his breath. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but I assumed he was speaking to me, so I said, "I couldn't hear you." He began to speak, quietly and rapidly, saying things like, "You're always yelling at me. I've told you time and time again I do not appreciate being yelled at, but do you listen? No. Well, I'm done listening to you now. Do you hear that?" I was at a complete loss. I didn't know what to say in response, or if I should say anything at all. I contemplated just jumping out of the car, but nixed that idea when I realized the door lock was missing. There was just a silver-lined hole where it should have been. I'd started to cry, and debate with myself about causing an accident by grabbing the wheel and hoping for the best. At least, I figured, there was a chance I'd survive that. When he suddenly looked at me for the first time since I had gotten into the car. He blinked several times, rapidly, then slowed the car down, pulling into a gas station. I waited to see if he'd unlock the doors, not wanting to say anything to set him off again. After a minute or two, he quietly said, "I think I better let you out here," and hit the button to open the locks. I wasn't about to hesitate. I jumped out of the car as if it was on fire. I was about to turn and walk into the gas station when he called my name. He looked so damn sad, I even hesitated. He apologized, said he was sorry if he'd frightened me, that he never would have harmed me, and asked if I'd be able to get home okay. I said I would, and closed the door. He began to pull out of the gas station lot, but stopped suddenly. He just sat there for a couple of moments, his head down. I froze, wondering what the hell he was up to, and was about to run into the gas station, but he opened his window and yelled at me, waving something in his hand. My hat. I'd left it on his seat. I rarely approached his side of the car, and he handed it to me, and apologized again. I didn't know what else to say, so I just said, "Thanks." I watched as he drove off, making sure he was out of sight before moving on so he wouldn't know which direction I was heading. I decided to go to a friend's place instead of home. As I walked, I went to put my hat back and on out fell a piece of paper. Folded into the paper was a $100 bill. The paper said, "I'm sorry, please take a cab and don't hitchhike anymore tonight." I didn't. In fact, it was the last time I ever hitched a ride alone. This happened back when I was 21 and living downtown with my boyfriend. I had just found out that my boyfriend, who I'd been living for almost 4 years, had been cheating on me. We were invited to a Halloween party that night and had initially declined the invite. But then I found out about the cheating and I told him I was going. He could stay home if he wanted. Anyway, the breakup is relevant to frame my mind. We lived in a rather sketchy area downtown, one of those brand new apartments built in a slummy area sort of things. Any other night, I'm the type who keeps the car windows up and all the doors locked until I'm out of this sketchy area. However, my mind was understandably elsewhere, and I had both driver and passenger windows down so I could smoke a cigarette. The first red light I came to on the way to the party was still in the shady part of town. I'm the first car at the light, so I have a full view of a 20-something guy crossing the crosswalk left to right in front of my car. Suddenly, he looks over and makes eye contact with me. I'm flicking ash from my cigarette out the window at this point. I may have done a polite head nod. Can't remember. Next thing I know, he picks up his pace and walks over to my open passenger window, leans into my car, and asks if he can have a light. When flustered, I tend to be polite, so without really thinking, I hand him my lighter. I was totally prepared to just pull away when the light turned green and let him have it. That's when, instead of reaching for the lighter, he reaches into my car and lets himself in. Just sits down like we're old friends. At this point, the light turns green, and I grab my purse and wedge it between my left leg and the driver's side door. Apparently, I was more concerned with being robbed than the darker alternative. He thanks me for giving him a ride, and I slowly pull away from the stoplight, with cars behind me, and ask him why he got into my car. He replies that he could tell I wanted to give him a ride, and launches into an oblivious fabricated story about needing a ride because his girlfriend had just broken up with him and left him stranded downtown. I tell him I'll take him to the nearest gas station, as I needed to get gas. The gas station was only about 6 blocks away, but it was the longest 6 blocks of my life. He tells me I'm pretty, and asks for money so he can get a cab home. Like a complete idiot, I offer him $4 in quarters I keep in my car for the parking meters. At this point, I think I was just ready to make him stop talking and leave me alone. Instead, he starts throwing the quarters one by one down the cleavage of my shirt. What the F? I ask him to stop. He just laughs. Then I finally see it, the gas station. I pull in and tell him we need to both get out so I can pump. He hesitates, and then gets out. I have never locked my door so fast in my life. I walk inside, telling him I need to prepay. Instead, I find the first group of people I can, and explain the situation. Now this is where it gets ridiculous. At this time, a guy with the group I'm talking with comes in and tells his buddies that the guy is out there telling him I'm his girlfriend, and that I accidentally drove away with my purse on top of the car. The group of college kids ended up going outside, making him leave, and then sticking around until I was back on my car and on my way.